This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. You're watching a series of lectures on Immanuel Kant, probably the most important theologian, the last philosopher of the last 300 years. Certainly is, and certainly had the most effect upon theological thinking. And last time I talked a bit about how Kant kind of leaves us at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason with this deterministic, this determinism, universal determinism that exists within the phenomenal order. And however, from the inside, if you will, as living beings, we have this experience of duty, and the necessary condition for duty is freedom. And so we know that we are free immediately, if you will. Now I'm going to get into language that's used later by Hegel, but in the immediacy, right, of the noumenal, I am free, and in the mediacy, as I look out and I understand myself through the categories, the pure concepts of the understanding and the empirical concepts and the pure concepts of the understanding, then I am determined. And of course, Kant uses in this immediacy, this is the Verstand, the understanding knows things under the empirical and pure concepts of the understanding. Understanding knows things as falling into deterministic laws, right? But reason, as it's used, pure practical reason, right? It can understand that there is freedom. Now, the fundamental problem of metaphysics has been that the metaphysical tradition has tended to use this and think that they can drive truths out here in the order of the world, the order as we experience the world immediately. And this is the fundamental problem. We cannot do that. Now, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he talks a lot about reason, and he talks about its unconditional nature and the fact that we must think things a certain way. Then metaphysics is a natural part of us, and we must think things a certain way. However, they need not be that way in reality, and the supersensible world in which we think we're thinking definite things is not a world that we can say actually exists like this other world. It's more like a, well, some people would almost call it a fictive world, but it's a world, it's a heuristic, it's a way of thinking, it's an interpretation that can be given, but it's not any longer holding that these are real in this sense. Now, in the Critique of Judgment, it's got another word now, Urteil. Urteil is supposed to mediate between the understanding, Verstand, and reason, Vernunft. Kant says that the power of judgment is to think the particular within the universal. To think the particular within the universal. So to take up the particular in the universal. I'm using language here that, of course, one would think of when thinking of Hegel. When the universal is given, the power of judgment, thinking the particular under it, results in a determinate judgment. When a universal is given, the power of judgment that thinks the particular under it results in a determinate judgment. What did I say? When the universal is given, okay. When the particular is given, the power of judgment to find the universals under which the particular is subsumed results in a reflective judgment. So he's got this distinction between a determinate judgment and a reflective judgment. And we won't get deeply into this, except just to mention a couple points here. From the standpoint of the first critique, of course, there is no purpose in nature. However, from the standpoint of the reflective judgment, right, the reflective judgment, when the particular is given, the power of the judgment to find the universals under which the particular is subsumed, that is a reflective judgment. From the standpoint of this kind of judgment, human beings are entitled to treat nature as if it had a purpose and as if it were ultimately intelligible, as if it were designed, right? So, I mean, here now, freedom can be discerned in the events and the processes of nature as organizations for particular ends are produced. There's freedom and purpose in nature. Of course, there really is no freedom and purpose in nature. Now, see, there's a lot of guys, and when I went to graduate school, people I talked to Kant about, and Kant had Kant in lecture. These guys weren't interested in the critique of judgment at all. They thought, well, Kant had kind of lost it here in the critique of judgment. But the critique of judgment is enormously influential in the theological tradition, okay? And it's very influential in this tradition that runs through Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, that becomes very dominant in the 19th century. Also in this text, he talks about beauty, he distinguishes sublimity from beauty, and so it's a very important text as well for that. And I'm not going to talk more about it right now, except to say that it's an attempt to, within a naturalistic framework, to make use of, again, these notions of purpose and freedom in a way that's not just immediately tied to the ethical. Okay. Okay, so some of you are asking, well, what did Kant accomplish theologically? What is bequeathed to the tradition by Immanuel Kant? Well, after Kant, thinkers were not at all sanguine that any knowledge of God was possible. So theology, which had been an academic discipline where people, studied God's connections with other things, now it looks like there's nothing to study. So confessional theology can survive, but it's no longer in the university in the same way, right? Now I'm skipping over a bunch of development here because, of course, you can still go into a German university and get a theology degree, but you better know your Kant, right? So knowledge of God is not considered possible in the same way it was before. Talk of God is taken to be regulative as an ideal of pure reason rather than an existent being. So the notion of God becomes important after Kant. And then you see this in Schleiermacher and others. I mean, the concept of God, or das Gefühl der schlechthinnigen Abhängigkeit, the feeling of absolute dependence, this stuff is important, but they're not any longer talking about a God as an existing being that is what it is apart from human awareness, perception, conception, and language. 3, talk of God was regarded as best grounded in human moral experience. That's immediately after Kant, and we find this in Fichte and Schelling. So we have an indirect argument for God based upon our experience as moral agents, but somehow the moral life is deeper than the religious life. 4, following Kant, religious language is seen as a way to deal picturesquely, if you will, with moral experience. Philosophy, religion becomes something that is a picturesque way of expressing deeper philosophical truth. Okay, then 5, talk of God and nature must finally depend upon the faculty of judgment, which is somehow to mediate then the dead deterministic world of physics to the rich, lively, freedomful world of moral experience. So this whole development that I alluded to before. And judgment must finally bring together somehow the nominal and the numinal, phenomenal and the numinal. And talk of God is now somehow related to this bringing together of the phenomenal and the numinal. Now, I got to tell you, Kant never says here that God does not exist as a being that exists apart from human awareness, conception, perception, and language. But it's very clear that Kant's not very interested in this question, okay? You read Kant and you read the newer biographies of Kant, And Kant is very much a metaphysician of his age. He has to deal with the supersensible, but he critiques it very deeply. And so talk of God after Kant now becomes more problematic. What is it we're talking about when we talk of God? So when we get to Schleiermacher, well, when we're talking about God, what we're talking about is the whence, the feeling of absolute dependence, right? For ritual, talk of God is related always to the moral experience. For Hegel, talk of God is somehow related to absolute spirit, which is, of course, thought thinking itself through us. So it's tied up with human experience as thinking, feeling beings of some kind. And of course, it's because of all this work, these post-Kantian trajectories of the 19th century, that a guy like Barth could in the early 20th century say, hey, hold it, boys. You can't talk about God by talking about man with a loud voice. 19th century is a time in which we try to talk about God somehow in human moral experience, human depth experience, human religious experience, right? All right. Well, there's a little primer on Kant for you. This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology and the Institute of Lutheran Theology, and I thank you for listening to this lecture and many others. Have a great day, and God bless you.